I'll admit it. I have no artistic skills. I can't draw, I can't paint, I can't even build interesting things with blocks. So for most of my life, I've strenuously avoided anything that feels like being a maker. But that doesn't mean I didn't envy it at times. I know many people, at all skill levels, who love making things with their hands. But it wasn't the beautiful things they make that piqued my interest, although they're certainly wonderful. It was the process itself. It was how they'd get in the zone while working. They'd lose track of time and of their daily worries. Sometimes it seemed they'd even lose themselves. All their attention was so focused on what they were doing. And what seemed like the best part was that when they were done for the day, they seemed renewed, not burned out. And to someone like me, who works hard but doesn't usually feel joy from it, that struck a chord. It made me wonder, what is it about craft that makes this possible? And why do many people find it nourishes their souls? To find out, we'll talk with Stuart Kestenbaum, poet and former director of the world-renowned Haystack Mountain School of Crafts in Maine.
You hit a thing with a hammer and it's going to respond. There's so many parts of how we live now where you don't have that kind of cause and effect. Literally, working with materials puts you in touch.
With Claremont Graduate University psychologist Jeanne Nakamura about the science behind the experience of flow that many makers feel.
It's an experience that people think of as positive, sometimes as the most engaging moments of their daily lives.
And with two very different artists, Tibetan Lama and mandala master Losang Samten, and Native American glass artist Preston Singletary, about how working with materials can build resilience and a sense of meaning in our lives. I'm Dave DeSteno, and this is How God Works. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi was just 7 years old when World War II hit Europe, and the world around him suddenly became very chaotic. One of the things that struck him most was seeing how many of the adults in his life just kind of fell apart in the face of losing their stable jobs and homes. So maybe it's not so surprising that years later, when he moved to the US and eventually became a renowned psychologist, he was always coming back to this basic question. Life can be tough, and there's a lot of suffering in the world. So what is it that enables some people to maintain a sense of meaning and contentedness, to feel like their life is essentially a happy one, even in the face of challenges?
Artists seem to get completely immersed in what they were doing when they were painting or drawing, to the point that they didn't recognize what was going on around them.
His former student, Jeanne Nakamura, recalls that he got one of his first hints by observing creative people at work.
But then when they finished a painting, they tended to just forget about it. So they clearly weren't doing it to have the painting. They were doing it for something that was inherent in the activity itself, that lay inside the process of making the artwork. And that led him to be curious about what the experiential rewards are that must be responsible for the willingness of artists and others to engage in an activity for long periods of time with very few extrinsic rewards.
Csikszentmihalyi coined a new term for this type of experience: flow. Now, we've all heard people use this term or similar ones in a colloquial way. You know, get in the flow, get in the zone, wax on, wax off. Okay, I'm dating myself there. But Csikszentmihalyi meant something a little different. He was referring to a truly distinct psychological state, one that actually has pretty profound consequences, even though it's sometimes hard to achieve in the hectic, multitasking-obsessed world we live in.
The flow state, it's a state of deep, focused absorption, and it happens when you feel like you're neither under-challenged by the activity nor over-challenged by the activity, so you're using your capacities fully. And it's a state of concentration. Often people feel that time stands still, or conversely, that it passes very quickly. And often they say that they lose track of themselves. They lose that sense of self-consciousness that we have in daily life.
And is that normally a positive experience for people?
Yeah, it's experienced as positive. People are sufficiently immersed in the experience that they don't necessarily register that at the time. It's an experience that people think of as positive, sometimes as the most engaging moments of their daily lives.
So what's interesting to me there is you said as we do these activities, part of them become automatic, which means they kind of go without me consciously thinking about every single step I'm going to do X, Y, or Z. But in one way, freeing up your kind of conscious mind can open your mind up to lots of chatter. So I think about this when I'm driving the car, right? I can drive the car and it's pretty automatic and I'm not thinking about adjusting my speed and where I have to go and what those signals mean. I can carry on a conversation with who's ever in the passenger seat, or many times with myself, obsessing about things and thinking about things. But it sounds like in the flow experience, when you hit that kind of automation, that intuitive way of working on or doing whatever you're doing, it's more of that loss of self-awareness as opposed to kind of giving you space for more hyper self-awareness. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's such a great way of framing that. It's because the person who's engaged in the activity and does experience flow is working kind of at the limits of their skills. So the activity that's going on is demanding their attention, is requiring them to fully attend to it. The model is that you're kind of bouncing between experiences where you're actually under-challenged and start to feel bored, or you're over-challenged and you start to feel stressed by the activity. So it's that kind of balancing between those two and finding the spot where the challenges are using your skills but are not threatening you. That's part of the dynamic of flow. I'm not a rock climber, but it's such an easy example to think about. The climber who has some experience isn't trying to figure out what a handhold is. They're paying all their attention, though, to where they're going to put their hand next and how it feels to have done so.
I see. So some of it is automatized, but other parts aren't. And they require us to kind of be fully present in focusing on that, so much so that our kind of sense of self can slip away.
Yeah, and that's a defining element of being in the flow state, is that loss of self-consciousness. If you think about what's going on when you're in the flow state, you're engaged with an interaction with the environment of some kind. So that loss of self-awareness is a loss of the reflective self, the self that's looking at you and judging you and monitoring you. It's not a loss of awareness of the self that's acting. So that climber who's reaching for the next handhold is entirely aware of what their hand is doing and whether they think they're moving in the right direction. So it's not the loss of the self as an agent. It's a loss of the self as an object of attention, becoming one with the rock. That is something that people say. So there is sometimes a sense of transcendence of the self that goes along with those really intense experiences of flow.
It's that sense of transcendence that can give flow something of a spiritual tone at times. After all, the sense of merging is a defining feature of mystical experiences. But when it comes to flow from creating things, the give and take of working with a material can offer an added element.
I think we maybe tend to think of flow as very sort of active. The person is making things happen, but that receptive phase is an important part of the flow experience too. Crafts, activities that have a physical medium that you're working in many respects are sort of prototypes of flow activities. They lend themselves much more to experiencing flow than an activity like thinking, where you're dealing with a symbolic medium, because the interaction with the object is giving you a very concrete, direct feedback, which is one of the conditions for entering the flow state.
The physicality of craft ranges immensely. From the small finger movements of sewing a quilt or the subtle hand gestures in shaping a lump of clay, to activities that involve using much more of your body. For Preston Singletary, a Tlingit artist from Seattle, working with glass requires much more than just using his hands.
You're lifting, you're using your bicep when you're lifting the pipe. There's this whole fulcrum there that you're pushing down and you're lifting up. At the same time, it's all moving. So it's like this balancing act. Glass blowing, I think, really, it requires an economy of moves. Everyone says it's like a dance. And I love being around the furnace and the smells like burning cherry wood and beeswax that we use on the hot tools and stuff like that. It's kind of a meditative process in a lot of ways.
As Jeanne said earlier, flow activities are characterized by this kind of back and forth between a person and their physical environment. For Preston, it opened his mind to a different way of looking at things.
About 20 years ago, I started to do Aikido. It's a martial art, and you're always working from your center. So you're moving in such a way with an opposing force. Somebody is coming at you, and you have to kind of step to the side and turn their energy away from you. And so you're working with this force, this opposing force, and I started to equate it with glass. I'm moving my body to kind of react to the glass and how it's moving. And I got this sense of movement with the material and a connection to it. Through this Aikido training, I started moving in a different way, lifting the blowpipe in a different way. And I realized that it was all interconnected.
People craft for different reasons. For some, it's a job. For some, it's a passion. For some, it's both. And that raises an important question. What role does motive play? Is it harder to enter flow if your focus is on monetizing what you're making or finding fame from what you create?
I mean, it's really interesting because in that same study that was the beginnings of Mike's research on flow, they followed up those artists early in their careers, and they found that the people who were most intrinsically motivated, most doing it for sort of the love of the process itself, were the ones who continued even if they weren't initially successful. But the ones who were more extrinsically motivated dropped out if they didn't become successful quickly. You have to think about the fact that in the activity itself, if you're experiencing flow, everything else is kind of outside of the frame of mind. So the question would really have more to do with whether or not it affects the way that you enter the experience and whether or not it becomes a barrier to entering the state.
That's true. Am I thinking about doing this, not kind of going with the flow, pardon the pun, but thinking about, maybe I better do it this way because it will be more commercially acceptable. And so in doing that intention and awareness kind of breaks the whole idea of the state.
Exactly, because somebody who's in the activity for the enjoyment of it is still making those kinds of evaluations of what they're doing, but they're driven by the emerging goal that they have for the work of art, right? And it's not that they have an internalized standards of quality of some kind, but it isn't the case that they're stepping away from the work to judge it in terms of its market value, for example.
So when you're making things in the flow state, yes, you have a goal, but in reality, it's not where you end up. It's really more the process. It's the journey that matters.
We sometimes talk about the motivation in the flow state as emergent motivation, in the sense that there is a goal to start with of some kind, but there's a constant process of adjusting in response to what's happening. So the painter who is groping their way towards a representation of something is reacting to what's happening on the canvas. The work that Csikszentmihalyi did with artists was looking at the extent to which they were engaged in those kinds of exploratory behaviors. And the more exploratory behaviors were associated with the creativity, the originality of the works that they produced.
I really like that idea of emergent motivation because I will hear artists oftentimes talk about, sculptors. There was something in the wood or in the stone that was there that I had to uncover in kind of discussion or conversation with it, metaphorically speaking. And it is that being open to change, to making those intuitive adjustments as you go.
Literally, working with materials puts you in touch. I think that's what draws people to it.
Stuart Kestenbaum is a poet. He was actually Poet Laureate of Maine from 2016 to 2021. But before that, he ran the Haystack Mountain School of Crafts in Maine. And one of the special things about Haystack is that every 2-week residency brings people together from truly all walks of life.
Or you take a workshop in a medium that's not yours and you say, I have no idea what I'm doing. I think I'll try this. Or you might have a physician who thinks working in clay makes him a better doctor, somebody who works as a lawyer, somebody who's in graduate school in ceramics, somebody who just graduated from high school and is taking a gap year, all in a workshop together, and somebody could be 18 and somebody could be 80. You put together a kind of odd, amazing community.
Over the years, Stuart has witnessed it time and again. The flow state that comes from making beautiful things isn't exclusively for professional artists.
We had the studios open 24 hours a day. Some people would be in there late at night. Grad students from MIT writing computer programs with the blue screen light, and blacksmiths hammering with red-hot steel, all working together like crazy enough to try an idea and obsessed enough to keep at it till they got it right. And I thought, really, I've been thinking there's a difference between these two worlds, but I don't think there is. I think it's all creativity and wanting to go so deeply into a thing that you don't leave it till you figure out what it is. You know, when people used to roll down the windows in their cars, which you don't do anymore, but, you know, you just let everything kind of blow through. And I think there's a certain moment, if you get past that and you just like at work, then things happen.
Yeah, I think that central act of creating something, the way you said, you know, you can get out of your head and do it with your hands, because a lot of the stresses and anxieties people suffer from nowadays really come from being, in many ways, trapped in our head and always worried about, am I doing the right thing, being evaluated, kind of watching ourselves as an audience and critiquing ourselves. Whereas when you can let that slip away and have that intuitive, creative act with your hands, I would imagine that can be an exceedingly joyful experience.
And that's so rare to be able to just say, this is what I love, I'm doing it all day, and tomorrow I'm going to do it all day too.
Regardless of skill, the sheer physicality of craft can put people in a state of mind that's often transformative.
You know, after World War II, a lot of soldiers came back and went to school on the GI Bill. Many noted artists went to school, and it really spawned a movement in contemporary craft of a feeling like, well, if the world's out of control, you know, this is something that actually connects me. I think it felt like a more original way of being. I can touch this thing, I can make it, I can control it. Because you're working with a material, you actually can see what happens to it. You know, we've moved so far away from that. I mean, there's so many parts of how we live now where you don't have that kind of cause and effect. You hit a thing with a hammer and it's going to respond. It's very direct. It becomes a way of how you get connected.
Each hit of a hammer, each stroke of a brush centers us a bit. Yes, we're trying to shape something, but it's also shaping us.
It's a kind of dialogue that you have between the maker and the material. It's a relationship. You can't say, well, this is how it's going to be. See? It's like you can't make a material do what it doesn't want to do. I think of how many times you can go through the world thinking, well, it's supposed to be this way. I want to make it this way. Like if you're flying somewhere and your flight gets delayed, you could spend your whole time thinking, this wasn't supposed to be this way. I can't believe I'm here. I'm stuck. Or you can say, hey, I'm in an airport. And this is where I am right now. And I think that's a meditation in a way. And I think people who work with materials have that.
Practicing a craft teaches patience and acceptance. And with those comes an ability to be present, to be open to possibility instead of full of frustration or regret. But does that mean that people can actually use their craft not only as a way to create something, but also as a tool to curate their own well-being?
One of the things that people say about a flow activity is that it is kind of a respite or a refuge from worrying and negative thoughts. And so there has been some research that's taken that insight and tried to see if anxiety about something that you can't do anything about can be allayed by deliberately engaging in flow activities. And the context that was chosen for those studies was people who were waiting for the results of exams, like bar exams. And they did find that it both increased positive feelings and reduced negative feelings, and probably most germane to the study, reduced worry. So it has been shown in experimental contexts that it can be used that way.
how does it help people to flourish in their daily lives?
Yeah, so there's different ways of flourishing. If you think of flourishing as living well and feeling good about your life, flow is an experience because it's putting you at the edge of your skills that is intimately connected with growth over time. It's that sort of connection to development. It's that connection of the experience of engagement in an activity over time to the growth of skills and also to the realization of one's own capacities that makes it a source of flourishing.
Flow through craft can provide a path to flourishing. But for the Venerable Losang Samten, it was also his salvation.
I was born in Tibet, and unfortunately, Tibet, we lost our beautiful country, 1959.
Losang had a really difficult life as a kid. After China invaded Tibet in 1959, he and his family became refugees, experiencing hunger and losing loved ones. From early on, Losang had a sense that becoming a monk was a path to overcoming all this suffering. And after his family finally settled in India, that's what he did. Losang eventually joined Namgyal Monastery, the Dalai Lama's monastery. And it was here that he began learning a form of meditative craft that had long been practiced at Namgyal, the ancient tradition of making sand mandalas. Mandalas are intricate Buddhist devotional images, usually featuring a prominent circular pattern representing the Buddhist understanding of the universe. Sand mandalas, as the name suggests, are made by carefully pouring or placing tiny amounts of different colored sand to create these beautiful, incredibly detailed designs. They vary in size, but some of them are huge, several feet by several feet, and they can take up to a month to complete. For Losang, learning how to make a mandala took years of studying how to make highly precise measurements and get the designs and the colors just right. But these days, he no longer needs to run through all the rules while he works. It's all about flow.
When I creating the mandala, when I designing, putting the sand on the table, I simply just beginning, I know exactly what design I'm going to do. And then when I'm doing it, I'm not really thinking it. That's really the fact.
After living and training for 20 years in the monastery, the Dalai Lama sent Losang to the U.S. to make the first ever mandala in the West.
In 1988, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and my monastery did send to New York. And then I jokingly say, since then, my nickname is a Mandala Man.
Losang is kidding around, but that nickname is no joke. If you look up sand mandalas on Wikipedia, it lists just two notable artists, the Dalai Lama and Losang. But before he could become the Mandala Man, Losang had to make some adjustments. Now that he was in the U.S., he wasn't making mandalas in the quiet spiritual environment of the monastery anymore. All of a sudden, he was in the American Museum of Natural History, with thousands of people milling in and out. And even though there were signs for people to be quiet, there was constant noise, people coming up and asking questions and chattering away. Eventually, though, he learned to transcend the noisy environment and the distractions, and even the stress that it could normally cause.
Since 1988 up to 2023, what had changed is my focus, my concentration is really improved. Really, really improved. It's so funny. Our mind has a tremendous gift that we have. So gradually, how much noise there, it doesn't bother me at all these days. Not only it does not bother me, but I could not hear it. It's just so calm and peaceful. External noise doesn't bother me at all.
That's the power of the flow state. By immersing himself in his discipline, over time Losang adapted and grew. He was able to maintain a sense of harmony, of balance. Which brings us back to rock climbing. If you thought there wasn't much in common between a rock climber and a Tibetan monk, you might want to reconsider.
One time I met a gentleman in Lake Tahoe, and he climbing a rock. And he was way up there, and I was just wondering, and I watched, and he came down. And I asked him, when you are way up there, really very scary, even my body is shaking. But when you're up there, what are you thinking, my dear? He said, I'm not thinking anything. And then when he said to me, and then it clicked to my mind, said, that's true. When I'm doing the mandala, I'm not thinking anything.
I think this is one reason why many spiritual traditions also use craft. The flow state, like meditation, can foster feelings of harmony, connection, and growth. Medieval monks spent hours upon hours illuminating sacred texts with beautiful art. Buddhist monks like Losang carefully pour sand to create stunning sacred images. But crafting in a spiritual tradition adds something else. Every detail of these beautiful, intricate designs also happens to hold deep meaning.
The green generally represents the air. Why I'm alive? Because of my air is breathing in and out. Seeing the green color on the mandala, we know we be breathing in and out constantly. But then sometimes we forgot about we are not paying attention. Our breathing in and out, just not listening. So it's a training how to be close to the natural, to the organic. The lotus flower have a tremendous meaning. In India, lotus grows from very muddy water. We cannot drink that water. It's very muddy. But yet, that lotus flower grows from the muddy water. When they open the petals so beautifully, there's no any muddy or anything. So which means each human being, we have a lot of pain, living with a lot of stress, but we each one have a gift. Each one have a capacity or seeds within us about the compassion. Mandala is for the message, for understanding of who we are and what capable we have to overcome suffering and journey to the enlightenment, we call it.
This message isn't just for the artist. Perhaps the most memorable thing about sand mandalas is that after all this painstaking work getting the designs and colors just right, holding your breath while placing individual grains of sand in the exact place you want, creating this amazing, intricate work of art, the makers of mandalas destroy their work. The whole point of making sand mandalas is to help us understand one of the truths Buddhists believe humans have the hardest time processing: the impermanence of absolutely everything in the universe, that nothing lasts forever, no matter how elaborate. For Preston Singletary, incorporating symbols from his Tlingit heritage into the glass art he makes can also add a deeper meaning for him and for others.
There was one mentor that I had. Her name was Clarissa Rizal. She was Tlingit as well. She said it's helpful for non-native people to see what we do because it's like the ancient codes and symbols to the land. In her estimation, can actually have a healing effect on the viewer. I try to use the shamanism thing like very loosely because I don't want to claim that I'm a shaman or anything, but it's like when I make an object that was typically considered a shaman's object, then I feel like that it has that that purpose, that its original purpose was to heal and was to, maybe define man's connection to the universe, or sort of the spirit, the nature spirit around them.
You don't need religion to get the benefit of craft. To the contrary, religious traditions often use craft as a learning tool. It's a technique to put people in a meditative state that can help them focus on the ideas and concepts each tradition offers. But crafting something beautiful, and the flow that can come from it, can nourish your spirit in whatever context makes sense for you.
When I first learned about the concept of flow, we were studying science and art, and there were physicists who talked about physics as a holy game. And I think that kind of captures the meaning that the activity holds for them, and the way in which it's a kind of a structure for meaningful experience in their lives. We interviewed scientists who look through a microscope and scientists who look through telescopes, and they are both in awe of what they're seeing. We interview artists, and they're struck by the way in which the muse speaks to them. And those are sources of meaning that take on a quality that is not unlike what you might hear from somebody talking about being moved in a spiritual sense in a religious context.
As a poet, Stuart Kestenbaum works with words rather than with wood or clay. I asked him if he sees any similarities between what he does and what he saw material artists doing at Haystack.
I think as a writer, when I was at Haystack and I'd see people, make stuff in clay and wood, and I just think, I kind of envied them because I just had words. You couldn't look at the end of the day and say, oh, look, they're all those things. But at some point, I also began to see it as to see the words as a material. If you know how to work with wood and a thing starts to happen with it, you say, oh, well, that happens with maple. I need to do this to make it okay. And if you work with words, you can say, well, if you choose this adjective, it's going to send it off in this direction. Or if you say it this way, it's going to send it in another direction. I think it allowed me to feel more generous with myself, kinder to myself, to say, give yourself a chance, make it the way it needs to be made. Like somebody working in craft is going to work at stuff to get it right, by and large. And I think it allowed me to see words as my material. So it really had an impact on how I looked at the making process. And always, if I go into writing with an expectation, like I'm supposed to write this thing, it's supposed to be this, it's always the worst experience. The worst result, I would think.
Does craft, whatever the medium, offer a way to grow and refresh our souls? I think the answer is yes, if we approach it with the right intention and mindset. And perhaps no one captures those better than Stuart in his poem, In Praise of Hands.
It's not just the people who live in the city who've lost the thread that ties them to the woven world of stones and earth, fields alive with pollen and wings. Who among us understands how oceans rise and fall, the current swirling around the planet with messages in bottles floating on the water? When the tide is out, we can go to the shore, dig clay with our bare hands, and make something beautiful from it, a vessel with thin walls that holds a canyon. In both hands, like an offering, we can hold the memory of eroded stones and earth, eons contained in this empty bowl. We can fill it with water that reflects the sky that has witnessed everything since time began. We can drink and be blessed. Clouds gathering over us.
Next time on How God Works, music is known as the universal language.
There's this beautiful line in the Talmud that says, where there's song, there is prayer. The idea that song and prayer are actually inextricably linked.
Music reaches further than any other expression from the external world.
Regardless of religion, culture, even time and place, it's something we can all understand and connect with. But why?
There's this activation in the brain that is involved in social connection, and we also see that it translates into social behavior. There's increases in empathy and cooperation and so forth.
We'll learn what's going on in our brains and bodies when we sing sacred songs together or listen to jazz.
Jazz, if you want to call it that, is an expression of higher ideals. It's like the windows of heaven had opened up and there was a pouring down of the Holy Spirit.
From Jewish nigunim to John Coltrane, we'll hear how music can deepen our connection with the divine, each other, and even with ourselves. How God Works is hosted and written by me, Dave DeSteno. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman, our producer is Sophie Eisenberg, and executive producer is Genevieve Sponsler. Melissa Streifert is our intern. Merritt Jacob is our mix engineer and composed our theme, which was arranged by Chloe DeSteno. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. This podcast was also made possible with support from the John Templeton Foundation. If you want to learn more, you can follow me on Twitter @David DeSteno.